So my name is Jeremy Magruder, and I'm going to be very briefly going over this outline for preaching on Nehemiah chapters 1 through 6. So really the story of the actual narrative of Nehemiah, I'd argue. Um, and it's really discussing the idea that God will set us on certain paths, but often those paths come with obstacles. That this is not a surprise, it's in fact part of the plan. This is a consistent way in which God works. The form of the story is that Nehemiah chooses to rebuild the walls in Jerusalem, and God confirms this decision by tremendous grace. However, Sanballat and Tobiah both oppose his movements, putting obstacles in the path that God has laid out. Furthermore, the Israelites themselves also create obstacles. Despite this, Nehemiah stays true to his calling, and God works mightily through him. So, really, we're talking about 3 points in Nehemiah's journey. Initially, Nehemiah's call, the calling that's been placed on his life, is confirmed. Upon hearing that Jerusalem's walls have been shattered and that the city has been sacked, he experiences great trouble in his heart, and we see that in chapter 1, verse 4. And then he prays for God's guidance and blessing and asks for favor as he goes in. And I think that although the text doesn't explicitly state this, that God definitely hears his prayer and grants him that favor. Looking at the idea of going to your employer who's of a rival nation and saying, it's making my heart sad that my homeland is destroyed. The idea that not only your employer would give you that time off to do it, um, to rebuild a rival nation, but would also basically choose to foot the bill, where he writes letters to his foresters and to his smiths. Um, I think that that's definitely God granting him a tremendous amount of favor in that. And so Nehemiah, the call that's been placed upon Nehemiah's life is confirmed in the beginning. And then Nehemiah almost immediately experiences trouble. And so we see that Sanballat and Tobiah both plan to attack the wall, and then later on they try to trick Nehemiah into coming out. And we see that in chapter 4, verses 7 through 14. We see that the Jews are selling themselves into slavery, that they're lending money to some of the builders, charging interest, saying you can't pay the interest, so we need to sell your son into slavery, back into exile, although we just purchased them. Um, and then the final one, though there are a couple of different final ones that I could have chosen, I chose Sanballat and Tobiah hiring a prophet to tell Nehemiah to go into the temple. The reason why I'm choosing this one is really because it highlights the idea that we need to be listening very closely to God's call. In that a prophet has been hired, and so it would have been easy for Nehemiah to have simply heard his words and been like, oh, that's what God said. And I think that that's true in our church as well. We see pastors um, leading people in ways that we don't sense God is leading. And I think that it requires a certain amount of discernment for us to say, no, that's not actually God speaking at this point in time. And so Nehemiah immediately experiences these troubles when he's on the path that God has led him to go on. And it's very important that we understand that this is not unusual. This is not a Nehemiah specific story, but this happens with Joseph, it happens with Paul, it happens with David, it happens with Moses, and also with Jeremiah. If anything, this trouble that we experience when we're on God's path is in fact standard. And this is vital for our growth as a Christian, because if we go through our Christian life believing that if we're on our path that it will be trouble free, or that the trouble in fact means that we're no longer on our path, then we're going to get knocked off by things that are just part of life and part of how God actually operates. My final point is really the idea that God just works through that call. That after we persevere through this trouble, we can look back and see how God protected us. We can see how Nehemiah was surrounded by essentially 3 different people groups who all wanted to tear him down. And by Sanballat and Tobiah both had considerably more money and more resources than he had. And yet God was able to work through their preparation, through their decision to guard the walls. God was able to work through that and protect them. We can see that the nations realized what the Lord had done, and we see that at the end of chapter 6. Um, Nehemiah's calling is in fact completed. And so really that's the basis of this. Thank you.